Hi, my name is Tina and this is Knitting Blooms. You can find show notes for everything I talk about on my blog at www.knittingblooms.com. And if I miss a link, please feel free to contact me on Ravelry as Bloomingknitter, or you can email me at knittingblooms@gmail.com. Come and join the Ravelry group so you can be eligible for all the prize drawings. And be sure to introduce yourself so that I can get to know you also. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter as Bloomingknitter. And don't forget to click the like button on Facebook for Knitting Blooms. Over the years that I have been actively knitting, I have been asked numerous times to teach someone how to knit. And although I enjoy the time I spend with the people as I teach them to knit, sometimes they need extra reinforcement when I cannot be present to help them. So I'm going to start a series of basic beginner tutorials for those people who would like to learn how to knit. And even if you are an experienced knitter, maybe you can use these videos as a resource to help someone you know how to knit. The main thing that I tell people when I teach them to knit is that they have to understand that the first skein that they knit is purely practice. And I do ask them to knit the entire skein. They should not expect to knit a project right from the start. Sometimes this frustrates people because they feel like they are wasting time. However, I feel it gives them more leeway when it comes to mistakes. If they are trying to complete a scarf or a simple dishcloth, they may get frustrated if they continually make mistakes and not want to continue knitting. However, if they know the piece is just practice, they may feel more relaxed and not worry so much about mistakes. And once the new knitter is familiar with the stitches, then we can talk about fixing those mistakes. And although this first piece is nothing more than a sample or practice piece, I still recommend that a good yarn is used. I personally am not very inspired or excited about working with acrylic yarn. But if you put a good wool in my hand, I can knit all day. So I don't recommend that you purchase the cheapest yarn you can find for practice. Get a nice, reliable wool to get you started. I recommend a yarn such as Cascade 220 with a US 7, 8, or 9 needle size. Beginners tend to knit more tightly, so a 9 needle is probably the best place to start. They can always drop down a needle size if they find the knitting is too loose. Also, a beginner knitter may feel more comfortable using bamboo needles because the yarn doesn't slip as easily on the needles. I also recommend a light colored yarn versus a navy, black, or dark brown because the lighter color will let the stitches show more clearly and make it easier for the new knitter to learn how to read their knitting. I also tell new knitters that knitting is just a combination of 2 stitches. Once you know those 2 stitches, you can do just about anything in knitting. Whether you are right-handed or left-handed, you can still knit the same way. You are using 2 needles and 2 hands, and it doesn't matter whether you are right or left-handed. If you are left-handed, you may find continental knitting a bit easier to grasp. In this series, I will be covering both English style and continental style knitting. In this video, I will be focusing on the continental style of knitting. We will cover both the knit stitch and the purl stitch and how to use them together and separately. If you are interested in learning how to knit the English style of knitting, please check the blog for that tutorial. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to do the continental method of knitting. I've switched to a size 6 needle, and these are a US 4.25. And the reason I have done this is because I am a fairly average to loose knitter, so my stitches were not very controlled when I was doing it with this size 9. Again, like I mentioned, new knitters tend to be a little bit tighter, so starting with a size 9 is fine, but then you can always drop down a needle size. And you can always go up a needle size also, but usually I recommend at least an 8 or a 9 to start with. But I'm going to switch to a size 6 so I can show you again. So again, we're going to do the Continental method of knitting this time, where you hold the yarn in your left hand. We're going to start again with a slip knot, and I'll show you again. You're going to make a loop, and then you're going to pull that loop partially through the hole so that you can adjust that by pulling the tail. Okay, so we're going to put that on our needle. Now, even though we are going to hold the yarn in our left hand, we are still going to have our stitches on our left side as well. So that is why it doesn't matter if you are left-handed or right-handed. You're always going to have your starting stitches on your left side, and you're going to work them onto your right needle. Now, there's lots of different ways you can hold your yarn. I like to wrap it around my pinky and then wrap it around my first finger. So it's wrap over and around and then that way. So it just gives you a way to do it. Now, you can try all sorts of different methods of how you hold your yarn. The way I do it might not work for you, but you just try different methods and you'll find one that works for you. So now we're going to do the same thing that we did with the English style knitting, and we're going to create new stitches. So we're going to make sure we're not using the tail. We don't want to use the tail. We want to use the piece from the ball. We're going to stick the needle in. This we're going to just wrap it around because we're already behind the needle, behind the knitting, whereas before when we were on this, when we were holding the yarn, we were wrapping it around the back of the needle. Right now we're kind of scooping it up from the back. Okay, so we're going to scoop it up, and I'm just going to hold my finger there so that it makes it easier for me to pull that stitch through. So now we have 2 stitches on the needle, and just like before, I'm going to stick my needle in and drop it off that needle. Now, I don't typically cast on using the Continental method because I was taught how to knit English style. And I still find Continental knitting a little bit cumbersome for cast on, because I don't typically do the cast on with Continental knitting. I usually cast on using the English style knitting and then start knitting Continental. Again, you're going to come through the front of the needle, the stitch, scoop the yarn. I'm just going to hold it down to make it a little easier for me to scoop it through. And then I'm going to pull it through and then stick my left needle in. And it's a little bit more difficult to get the stitch a little bit snug on the needle with Continental. And like I said, I am still somewhat cumbersome. The Continental cast on is somewhat cumbersome to me. So again, I'm going to stick the needle in, wrap the yarn around, hold it there for a minute because I need that little bit of help, pull the yarn through, and then slip my left needle in, and then give this yarn a little bit of tug just so that it tightens up that stitch a little bit. It's the same if you watch the first part of the video where I'm casting on with the English style. It's the same exact movement with the yarn. The yarn is doing exactly the same thing, except I am holding my yarn in my left hand instead of my right hand. And again, like I said, I like to just kind of hold my finger over the yarn, a little bit right here just to hold it down so that I can slip it through a little bit easier. And again, whether you're using the English style or the Continental style knitting, you're going to want to cast on between 20 and 30 stitches for your practice piece. And you just, again, you want to make sure that your stitch is snug on your needle, whatever size needle you're using, before you move on to the next stitch. So I think I have enough stitches there to show you. Now we're going to move on to actually doing the knit stitch. And like before, we've already kind of done the knit stitch. We are just going to transfer the stitches from the left needle to the right needle. So you're going to stick the needle in, wrap it around, pull it through. You have two stitches, one on the left side and one on the right side. We're going to drop the one on the left off. Again, pull the stitch through, wrap it around, and pull it through, and the other one off. Wrap it around and pull it through. Needle in, hold the yarn there just to give it a little bit of tension. And we're just, each time we're just pulling the stitch through. We're kind of pulling it in and then picking that yarn up. Sometimes Continental is called picking versus English style is called throwing, because you're kind of picking it with your needle. And it's also good, even if you want to learn English style, to go ahead and learn Continental style as well. I find that sometimes my hands get tired if I knit for long periods of time, and if I have a second method of knitting, such as to be able to alternate between English and Continental knitting, my hands don't get as tired because I can switch it up. Now sometimes people will knit tighter or looser in one knitting style versus the other, but I have somehow figured out how to keep my tension the same for both. So just like with the English style, we have all of our stitches on our right needle. We're going to move it to the left side and then start knitting again. And this is exactly the same that we were doing with the English style. Now I've got a little bit more substance to my knitting down here, so now I feel more comfortable just kind of picking that yarn. Those first couple rows when I do Continental is always been a little cumbersome because I don't, like I said, I don't typically knit Continental for cast on. I usually have my project started already. So again, you're slipping the stitch in, or the needle into the stitch and kind of grabbing that yarn. So stick it in and then you're kind of going behind and grabbing that yarn. Stick it into the stitch and then wrap it around the needle and pull it through. And that's all there is to Continental knitting. Same as the English. Just continue working in this fashion, creating rows until your work measures approximately 4 to 5 inches, and then you will be ready to move on to the purl stitch. And there you have it. That's Continental knitting of the knit stitch. Stay tuned to learn the purl stitch. So now that you have learned the knit stitch, we are going to learn the purl stitch. But before we do that, I just want to talk about the fabric that you're creating by knitting every row. Meaning that if this is the front of your work and you knit this row, and then this is the back of the work and you knit this row, then you are knitting every row, both the right side and the wrong side of the work. But if you are knitting on the right side of the work and purling on the back side of the work, you are getting a different type of fabric. But you will see that develop as we go through learning the purl stitch. Now I'm going to show you purling with the Continental method, where you hold the yarn in your left hand. Now this method is a little bit more cumbersome, but I have watched a number of people knit the purl stitch Continental, and I finally found a way that works for me. So what I show you today is the way that I purl my stitches using Continental, but you might find a better way to do the stitches that works for you. So again, we are going to be inserting our needle. Actually, we need to have our yarn in the front. Let's put the yarn in the front. Always have the yarn in the front, and I'm just going to kind of hold it down right here to kind of get it out of the way so I can see what I'm doing here with the needle, with the stitches. We're going to insert the needle from right to left, and we're going to wrap the yarn around the stitch. And again, we're going around the back of the stitch, and we're going around the back of the stitch and then slipping it off. Okay? Going around the back of the stitch and slipping it off. Now what I did there, I have my yarn here. My yarn is kind of up and over. All I'm doing is bringing my hand down, and when I do that, the yarn automatically wraps around the needle, and then all I have to do is pull it through. Keeping my yarn in front of the working of the needle with the stitches on it, I'm slipping the working needle in, and I am bringing my finger down and then slipping off. Slip it in, bring my finger down, and slip it off. See how the yarn is already kind of up and around. I'm just placing it on the other side so it makes it easy for me to scoop it. Like I said, there's a lot of different ways that you can do a purl stitch with Continental knitting. But this is the way that I have found that works for me. Now, it is said that Continental knitting is quicker than English style knitting, and in some ways it is, because you don't have to keep picking up the yarn in order to work your stitches. So there you have it. There's that purl bump again. Okay, so we'll go to the other side and we will do one full row of knitting again, because we are knitting on one side and purling on the other. So I will quickly just go through this so you can see that knit stitch again via Continental knitting. And we can already see that flat knitting emerging there. So we will come back, turn it this way again, and we have the yarn in front again. Okay, we're going to stick our needle in, wrap it. That first stitch on the row is always kind of a little wobbly until you can get that yarn secured. And again, this is just how I do the Continental purling. But I find that it works for me. I have tried other ways of doing the purl, and my yarn is just too hard to grasp with my needle to pull that loop through, doing it other ways. Now, you have noticed that I have been knitting on one side and purling on the other side. So originally, I had told you to, let's look at this side. Originally, we knit every row down here, and you should have done that for 4 to 5 inches. Now we are working knit on one side and purl on the other side. So you should work those stitches for about 4 to 5 inches. Now you'll see I switched which was my right side and which was my wrong side. So I have some stockinette, which is this section. This is garter ridge, which is knitting every row. And the stockinette is where you knit on the right side and purl on the wrong side. This, which is where I've knit on one side and purled on the other side, but because if this is the front of my work, this is actually considered reverse stockinette. But if I look at this side of my work, it looks just like the stockinette from the other side of the work. So it doesn't matter which side you're working on, because like I said before, this is just a practice piece. We're just practicing to see, to get comfortable with the stitches. So you should be working this section for 6 to 7 inches, because you have already learned the knit stitch and you did that for about 5 inches, and now you're going to do the purl stitch, but you're only doing the purl stitch every other row. So you want to do a little bit more more rows so that you have more practice with that. And once you finish that, then we can start combining the knit and purl stitches on the same row. So for now, you have learned both the knit and the purl stitch. You can experiment with the 2 stitches if you want, but definitely do 4 to 5 inches of the knit every row, and then do 6 to 7 inches, or maybe even 6 to 8 inches of the knit one side and purl the other side. So now that you've knit a few inches of the garter stitch, where you knit every row, and a few inches of the stockinette stitch where you knit one side and purl the other side, now we are going to talk about combining knit and purl stitches on the same row. And by doing this, you can create all sorts of fabulous patterns. So we are going to start out with just a basic rib pattern where you knit one stitch and then you purl one stitch, and you knit one stitch and you purl one stitch. And this is a ribbing that you might use on the cuff of a sweater or the cuff of a sock. It's a type of pattern that will kind of pull the knitting in some. Now we are going to do the same stitches, the knits and the purls in the ribbing with the Continental method of knitting. So we're going to hold the yarn in our left hand, and we're going to start off. And again, here's that V, so we know that we need to knit that stitch. So we're going to knit that first stitch. And then the next stitch is a purl, and we need to get that yarn in the front. So we're just going to kind of slide it over to the front of the needle, and we're going to purl that stitch. And then as we take that needle off, you see how that yarn just kind of popped back to the back? And now we're ready to go ahead and knit the next stitch. So now the next stitch is a purl, so we just kind of slide that yarn to the front of the needle and then purl it. And watch as I take this needle off, that yarn, the working yarn, is going to just fall right to the back, which is going to put us right where we need it to be to do the next knit stitch. And then slide it to the front to do the purl. And then as we slide that stitch off the needle, it's going to pop right back to the back where we need it for the next knit stitch. And that's one thing about continental knitting, is that you're not constantly moving the yarn one way or the other. Because as you work with it, it kind of automatically does what you need it to do. And once we're done, we'll flip it over to the other side and we'll do it again. Again, the first stitch is a V, so we're going to knit, and then there's a bump, so we're going to purl. If you look at this side, you can see bumps here and V's here. Bumps and V's and bumps and V's and bumps and V's. When I flip this over, you see the same thing. Bumps and V's, bumps, V's and bumps, V's and bumps. Okay, and so it looks exactly the same. And there you have it. So now as we look at it, those V's are kind of coming together and you don't see those bumps anymore. That is what ribbing is all about. Those V's are covering up the bumps. That they're coming together, and then the bumps are being covered up and they're falling to the back side. But if we turn it over this way, the same thing is happening. The V's are coming together and the bumps are falling behind. That is why you see how much the knitting has shrunk from the original number of stitches. So you can do this with knits and purls. You can do all sorts of different combinations with knits and purls to make different patterns. There's the seed stitch, the moss stitch. There's all sorts of different things you can do. You can even create your own graphic patterns, as far as maybe you want to make a Christmas tree or something like that. You can do that all with knits and purls. So continue practicing your knits and purls. Continue practicing them together and together on the same row, as well as individually for across the row. And once you have mastered the knit and the purl stitch, you are ready to go on and explore the world of knitting. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on basic knitting, and I hope you will share this with your friends who would like to learn how to knit. If you'd like to get in contact with me with your questions, please contact me at bloomingknitter@gmail.com, or you can contact me on Ravelry as Bloomingknitter. You can also check out other tutorials on the blog at knittingblooms.com. Thanks again. Bye.